So who was Jesus, really? This time of year, there's a lot of discussion around that point, and it never ceases to amaze me that every Easter Sunday, despite the fact that many people don't necessarily take time out of their day to go to church, that Newsweek and Time Magazine and a lot of other quote, secular publications will actually have an article or at least a whole publication revolving around that theme. It's a very good question to ask. It's the primary question that the four Gospels in the New Testament seek to answer. Who was Jesus really? Our particular guide for this journey in answering that question is one particular Gospel, the Gospel of Mark. And we've encouraged you over these weeks leading up to Easter to consider on your own, just to read through the Gospel of Mark on your own. It's the second book in the New Testament of the Bible. It's the shortest of the Gospels. And it's very action-oriented, so it's a pretty enjoyable read, actually. We do that for a couple of reasons. One is we recognize we're not going to deal with every story from the Gospel of Mark here in worship, but there's a lot of other good stuff in there. And the Holy Spirit will open your eyes to see some things that we're not going to talk about here, that you can walk away with and benefit from, because we believe the Scriptures speak to us all. The other thing that we're providing over the course of these weeks, there's some discussion questions after each Sunday morning message. Our ushers will be handing those to you as you leave today, and they're simply yours to use in whatever way, shape, or form you would find them helpful. Discuss them with a friend or over the dinner table as a family, or just whoever, just maybe take one or two, and just as a way to kind of personalize and maybe have a takeaway or two from our time together in worship. The Gospel of Mark. Last week we basically, I think, hit the apex of the Gospel when the Apostle Peter, when Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" came out with the incredible statement, "You are the Messiah." It finally clicked. What didn't click, however, was all the implications of that pronouncement. Peter's faith had come to a point where he could recognize that Jesus was the promised deliverer. But there were still aspects to Jesus' ministry and aspects to the Messiah that Peter and the other disciples still hadn't fully put together. And one of those aspects was this whole concept that God's Messiah was going to have to die before he could ultimately fulfill his message. In their minds, that didn't compute, because the Messiah who was not here was, well, not much of a very helpful Messiah at all, right? So they had a lot to learn. And 6 days later, we find that they're still kind of processing this whole thing. And so Jesus takes 3 of the 12 in particular and introduces them to, well, what I consider to be one of the most interesting and odd encounters in the entire gospel. I invite you to follow along while I read these words. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed, and his clothes became dazzling white, far whiter than any earthly bleach could ever make them. Then Elijah and Moses appeared and began talking with Jesus. Peter exclaimed, "Rabbi, it's wonderful for us to be here. Let's make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." He said this because he didn't really know what else to say. Or they were all terrified. Now hit the pause button. Have you ever been there? When you're in one of those situations and something very inexplicable is happening, and part of your brain is saying, keep your mouth this, but you just can't do it. And so you just say the first thing that comes to your mind, and instantly you wish, why didn't I just keep my mouth shut? That's kind of what Peter's feeling like right now. The problem, interesting about Peter does this repeatedly. If you read through the Gospels and look through Peter's noted for every time he doesn't know what to say, he says it anyway. That's just kind of his persona. I'm just letting you know that they're not so much different than us. The story goes down. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my dearly loved son. Listen to him." And suddenly, when they looked around, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus with them. And as they went back down the mountain, he told them not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. And so they kept it to themselves, but they often asked each other what he meant by rising from the dead. Then he asked them, "Why do the teachers of religious law insist that Elijah must return before the Messiah comes?" Jesus responded, "Elijah is indeed coming first to get everything ready. Yet why do the Scriptures say that the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be treated with utter contempt?" At this point, they're thinking, oh, we're back on this whole death thing again. We thought we had moved on. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they chose to abuse him, just as the Scriptures predicted. Now, I will tell you, if you're thinking this, it's okay, because this is what I think when I read this story. If you were to put this whole story kind of on the weirdness scale, this one's up there. I mean, it's almost like Jesus, somebody like sprinkled glitter glue on him. And you look at this, go, what's the point? And if you think about this story, too, if you had a little X-Acto knife and you just kind of cut this story out of your Bible, would it really matter that much? I mean, there's still plenty of information in here that tells us who Jesus is and why he came and what he accomplished. This story doesn't really seem on the surface to really give us much more information. It's just kind of an interesting encounter that, well, is almost unbelievable. So let's go with the idea, though, that there is a reason why this story is here, and it does help flesh out for us the picture of who Jesus is. This one, in order to better understand it, though, I think we need to take a look at the story from the standpoint of how we look at any story to better understand its purpose. Who are the characters? What's the dialogue amongst the characters? And what's the setting in which the story takes place? 3 clues to help us understand the story. Let's walk through each of those for a moment. Who are the characters in this story? Well, Jesus is one. And you've got, just interestingly enough, 3 of the 12 disciples. Not the whole bunch. 3 that he takes in particular. And they go up this mountain. The setting is an isolated place at the top of a mountain. And so there's Jesus and Peter, James, and John. They go up the mountain. And then there's also Moses and Elijah. Now, that's a little bit weird in itself. Why Moses and Elijah? Now, we'll talk about them and their presence in a couple of different ways. But let me just retrace for you a little bit the importance of these 2 figures in Old Testament history. Moses was revered by the Jews of the day and even today as the primary lawgiver. And he is presumably the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Elijah is a character that shows up personally about midway through the Bible, but the promise of what Elijah's mission would accomplish is in the final book of the Old Testament, the book of Malachi. And so Elijah and Moses serve somewhat as bookends of the entire Old Testament period. Both of which were part of the promise that God gave that someday he would send a deliverer. So one thing that their presence is telling when we ask the question, what do we learn about this whole Jesus thing by virtue of who's present at the event? The presence of Moses and the presence of Elijah tells us one thing, is this. Sometimes, when we think of the Bible, we kind of think of the Old Testament as simply, well, old. And there's not a lot in there of any practical or relevant value for us living on this side of the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. After all, isn't that the main event? Well, yes. And so we tend to presume that everything that happened in Act 1 was just kind of prelude, and there's nothing in there that's really currently relevant to life today. The presence of Moses and Elijah here on this mountain with Jesus is one way in which Jesus is affirming the fact, I did not come here to abolish the Old Testament. I did not come here to abolish the law. I did not come here to abolish the teaching of all that came before me. I came to fulfill it. And there is a difference. There is a difference between doing away with it and fulfilling it. Jesus said, I am here as one who fulfills it. Because he is the fulfillment of the Old Testament law and predictions, how they practice what is done in the Old Testament is about to change. But the truth that is embodied there is still relevant for today as it is any other day. And Jesus inviting these 2 guys to be a part of the party, so to speak, is one way that in very dramatic form these three disciples would understand the fact that there is a deep, deep connection with their root system. You and I share that same root system this morning. Jesus, in the midst of this, is transformed. He suddenly becomes glowing right, and he becomes radiant. And in this process is when Peter finally says, we need to build some tabernacles or something here. Jesus is transformed. He becomes radiant. That's probably the oddest part of the story. I don't blame the disciples for being afraid. But what's happening here? And why is it happening? Well, interestingly enough, coming back to Moses for a moment, Moses had a very interesting experience with God at one point. Some of you may remember it. You see, Moses was at a point where he said, God, if I'm going to do what you asked me to do, I need a little more than what you've given me to this point. Now you have to be really careful when you say that sort of stuff to God. Because sometimes God is literally going to say, you know what, I've given you enough. He's going to pat you on your little butt and say, get out there and do what I asked you to do. But in this case, God says, okay, that's cool. I get it. You need a little more encouragement, support, whatever. And says, so this is what I'm going to do, Moses. I'm going to allow my glory to pass in front of you. I'm going to allow my glory to pass in front of you. But here's the thing. Because of your sin, if you look, when my glory passes in front of me, you will die. So you need to turn your face away and look into the side of the mountain when my glory passes away. You'll feel my presence. You'll sense it. You'll know that it's me. It will be affirming. Just don't look. Moses complies. With the presence of Moses on the mountain with these three disciples, with Jesus suddenly glowing in glitter-glue fashion, these guys can't help remember that story. They would have grown up on that story as they go on. They can look at this. But there's two distinct differences here. There's two distinct differences here. One is, they're not turned away. They're looking right at it. They see the glory of God, and they recognize the fact that Jesus isn't merely pointing out the glory of God. He is the glory of God. Jesus is someone not only to believe in, to have faith in, to follow. He is an object of worship. And this is a new wrinkle for these guys. As they begin to understand in a little more fuller form that Jesus is saying, I am more than simply a human Messiah. I really am the Son of God, and I display His glory. They look at Jesus. Jesus is not just pointing towards the radiance of God and His glory. He is the glory of God. The other thing that's distinctly different about this time when Jesus does the whole glow-in-the-dark thing is they look right at Him, and they don't die. They're looking at Jesus and going, we should be dead. The way this went down, this way this used to go down, you look at God's glory, you die. Your sin can't be confronted with the glory and the perfection of God. They're not dead. This dawns on, wow. For the same reason. Because if Jesus is the embodiment of the glory of God, He is always also the central figure that allows us to experience it and see the glory of God without it bringing death into our lives. And so they look at this radiant thing and this transformation that Jesus goes through, and a story that seems, well, admittedly a bit odd to us, but to them, they're seeing the same thing reenacted a second time with two important differences, that suddenly Jesus is this glory. And because He is the glory, I need no longer fear it. Because Jesus is the one that embodies the glory of God. Now let's talk a little bit about the setting. It's isolated. There's only these three disciples. There's Jesus. There is the Moses and Elijah. And there's this voice that suddenly comes down. And so in this isolated setting, it's just them. So no one's going to see or hear anything. And Jesus ultimately says, after this is all done, you've just seen something really, really cool, but you can't tell anybody about it. Not yet. Why did he say that? Well, let's walk through that a little bit in terms of what's happening here. First of all, what did they talk about? What do we learn from the dialogue amongst these people? Well, the first thing I'd like to point out, there's a dialogue that happens that's not recorded. And you say, well, Pastor, how do you know that it happened if it's not recorded? Well, the reason I know that is because Peter, James, and John recognized Moses and Elijah. Now, have you ever walked into a church or an organization of any type and they're building, they've got, it's a church or an organization or something that's been around for a while. And you're walking around and you come into a hallway and you see all these pictures of past pastors or past presidents, and they go all the way back, and you finally get to a point, if it's old enough, where there's no picture, there's just a plaque on the wall. Why? Because photography hadn't been invented yet. Okay? These disciples did not have a picture of Moses and Elijah hanging on the wall in their synagogue. And there's no way they could, and so I'm really not sure exactly how they found out. I do know this, one of two things had to happen at least. On one hand, they had to ask Jesus, who are these guys? And why are they here? And where did they come from? And so that discussion obviously is not recorded, but they had to, or it could be Jesus said, come on, I got a couple people I want you to meet. That all happened. And the point again is that these guys had this conversation up there. Who are these guys? And then Peter says, this is great. We got Moses, we got Elijah, we got the two bookends of the Old Testament, we got the fulfillment of the prophecies, we got the three of us. I know there's 9 other guys down at the bottom of the mountain that would love to be here. Oh well. Too bad for them. So Peter says, let's build some shelters. Let's just kind of make this, just a wonderful camping experience from everybody. Let's just settle down right here and enjoy what we got. I mean, what more do you need? Moses, Jesus. And then all of a sudden this voice comes down through the cloud, and the voice says, this is my beloved son. Listen to him. They've heard these words before, but they kind of get emphasized again. So, and then they're gone. No more Moses, no more Elijah. Jesus is still there, but he's not glowing like he was. All of a sudden, back to reality. This is not a permanent situation. These disciples kept trying to want to get Jesus to kind of just go on hold, because they reached a point in their understanding of him and their experience with him where they said, this is good enough just as it is. And Jesus kept trying to move them one step further. And sometimes that was a real challenge. It's a challenge for you and me. And at the end of it, Jesus says, don't tell anyone. Not yet. Which leads me to what I think is one of the main points of this story for you and I today. And it's this. Has God ever surprised you in some way that he acts or reacts to a situation in your life in some way that you had never seen him react before? And you had, at that point, you had kind of come to the point in your relationship with God, your walk of discipleship, where you thought, this is good. Put it on hold. It's like when your kids are before they're teenagers and they're out the diaper stage. It's that in between. You go like, can we just put this on hold right now? I mean, they still listen, but they take care of themselves. It's just like you have a very small window. But that's how the disciples were. Can we just put this on hold? And you feel like I'm at that place in my life right now where I just wish God would let it be. And all of a sudden, he does something out of the ordinary, surprise you. You realize this little box that I've got my God in doesn't fit in there anymore. It doesn't fit in the box that I framed him in. This experience tells disciples, God's never going to fit in the box. I don't care if you perceive of God as a round peg, a square peg, a diamond peg. If you keep trying to pound him into your box, it's going to be an exercise in eternal frustration. Will not happen. What's the difference? God is saying, you know what? You got to get rid of the box. You got to give me room to work in your life in ways that you can't predict. You got to quit feeling like it's enough. this process of discipleship, this adventure that you share with me is a lifetime adventure. And that's why he says to the disciples, don't tell anybody yet. You know, sometimes God will do something in your life, and at some point, maybe there will be a story to tell. But initially, maybe it's not a story to tell. It's just an experience that God is leading you through to allow you to better experience and understand Him on a personal basis. It's just you and God. These guys, the story's not yet complete. They're still figuring out. He says, don't go running off telling everybody about this experience. First of all, they're going to think you're nuts. They're going to think you're crazy. Now, they probably thought that down the road anyway, but right now they're going to think they're even crazier. You see, after the resurrection, there at least was an empty tomb to point to make stories like this at least plausible. Prior to the resurrection, it was just weird. So he's saying, don't go run. Just allow this experience to help you better understand me. Maybe expand your box, or better yet, get rid of the box. But just let you know some new aspect from me.